You are listening to the Roberta Glass True Crime Report, putting the true back in true crime. From New York City, Roberta Glass is now on the record. My guest, Lisa O'Brien, is a native and resident of New Orleans, a graduate of Benjamin Franklin High School. Lisa has worked as a civil litigation paralegal on both the defense and plaintiff sides for over 3 decades. Lisa can be seen on the ABC 2020 special on Stacey Stites' murderer, Rodney Reed, entitled Stacey Stites, The Girl in the Pines. Lisa also co-hosted the Clear and Convincing podcast from 2015 till the podcast ended in this year, 2021. Lisa's unparalleled knowledge of the Reed case, as well as the legal system and so many other cases, makes her a treasured resource of this podcast. And in this episode, we are discussing the twice convicted triple child killers, Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly, aka the West Memphis Three, and their new lawsuit against the state of Arkansas for losing or destroying the evidence. Is this lawsuit really what it seems? Or, like with so many things in this case, is there more than meets the eye? Welcome, Lisa O'Brien. So, Lisa, I have been getting more comments about this West Memphis Three lawsuit, and mostly from West Memphis Three supporters who use this lawsuit to say, aha, see, Arkansas destroyed the evidence, they wanted to bury the evidence, and meaning it's proof of the West Memphis Three's innocence. Is that true?
No. This is, as with most other innocence fraud agendas, this is just another PR grab. Because if they really wanted to do DNA evidence, they wouldn't have been calling the prosecutor and trying to get the prosecutor to send the evidence to their lab. What they would have done was filed a petition in state court saying there's a new DNA testing method. We want this evidence tested with this new method, and we're entitled to that under the law. The reason they can't do that is because, first of all, there's a timeliness issue. In Arkansas, requests for DNA testing are not timely if they're filed more than 36 months after a conviction. The Alford pleas are a conviction. The Alford pleas were entered in August of 2011. Therefore, requests for DNA testing should have been made by August of 2014.
And so when you say timely, what I'm understanding, you're saying there's a cutoff.
Yes.
So after 36 months, that means, when I hear timely, I was like, oh, well, there's always untimely people. You can't be untimely. Is that my understanding? After 36 months cutoff?
Well, it's a rebuttable presumption. So if there is a new DNA testing method or methodology available.
Okay.
And that what they're alleging in the media is that this MVAC technology is new. But as Gary Meese pointed out in your prior episode, it's not new. It was available in 2011 because it was being used in Utah in 2011.
What is this MVAC technology? What is that?
It is a DNA collection method that was developed by a scientist in Utah. And basically, it's a wet collection method. So I guess a liquid is applied to evidence that does not have signs of obvious fluid or staining. And then the vacuum is run over and collects the liquid. And then that is processed to recover DNA. I'm not a scientist. I don't know if I'm even accurately describing the process. It's available on the internet. People can look it up. And there's even a video that shows you how it works.
Oh, interesting.
But basically, it's a way of collecting DNA from evidence that has a surface that isn't conducive to DNA collection, or from evidence that has been in storage for a long time that may not have been stored under ideal conditions. Actually, primarily for collecting epithelial or touch DNA.
Is Damien Eccles suing, or is his lawyer Patrick Benka suing?
His lawyer, Patrick Benka, is suing, but basically, if Benka is successful, that's not going to give them DNA testing. And that's another issue that I have with the media, Janice Broach and some of these other Arkansas reporters who are saying if it's successful, they'll get DNA testing. False. If it's successful, they'll get a response from the West Memphis Police Department as to the disposition of the evidence, what was lost, what was misplaced, what was destroyed. And again, the state's not trying the case in the media. The West Memphis PD is not trying it in the media. The DA isn't trying it in the media. So we don't have any direct information from the state as to whether evidence is actually lost or destroyed, or whether it perhaps was not returned by boat in 2011.
And this is, I think, the most sophisticated trial by media I've seen for the West Memphis Three campaign. For one, I always think I'm never going to talk about this case again, but I keep returning to it because I think if you can understand what I call the magic tricks that were done in this case, you can understand any case. Can you think of any other case that had such a sophisticated, we're telling the public this, but this is actually what's going on thing?
I think they all have elements of that. Cooper has it, Kevin Cooper, California, Rodney Reed in Texas,
Sure.
Mumia Abu Jamal in Pennsylvania. I think the distinction is that somehow Eccles, Baldwin, and Miss Kelly have become the cockroaches of the innocence fraud movement because they never seem to go away, as you point out.
Can you talk about what is an Alford plea?
An Alford plea is basically where a criminal defendant can say, I'm pleading guilty because it's in my best interest, because the state has sufficient evidence to convict me, but I want to be able to say I didn't do it.
Okay.
It's a guilty plea. They're convicted felons. They will be convicted felons for the rest of their lives. And there's no changing that unless they prove some irregularity with the plea. And it's been 10 years. Their SIS agreements have expired. They're not at risk of being put back in prison now. And so they really have no incentive to do anything. If they really wanted to do that, they should have done it between 2011 and 2021.
But the way the press wrote about their Alford plea is that new DNA evidence exonerated them.
There was inconclusive DNA evidence from 2 hairs, one found on a ligature and one found on a tree stump at the crime scene. And then there was a foreign allele on a penile swab, I believe from Steve Branch, that was from a male, but didn't exclude the universe of males. As much as they complain about the lack of forthrightness from the state, they weren't forthright with their DNA reports or their analytical reports.
Yes, and what are the DNA that we're still waiting to come back? There was a whole bunch of DNA tests.
Correct.
When was that tested?
That was tested in 2011, and basically they filed a status report on July 18th that basically said that most of the additional hairs that they tested in 2011 belonged to the victims, and then that there was additional testing in progress. And then on the 25th, they filed another status report that said that, well, that was the one where they said most of the hairs were profiles consistent with Chris Byers. One hair yielded a profile that wasn't consistent with any of the victims, which means it's inconclusive, even though it excluded Eccles, Baldwin, and Miss Kelly, and that there were 3 hairs incapable of being tested. So their DNA results were all inconsistent across the board because mitochondrial DNA is not a nuclear DNA identifying DNA. It either excludes or doesn't exclude.
Okay.
So their DNA was inconclusive. They had these witnesses who had some really great statements allegedly witnessing abuse of Steve by Terry Hobbs, but they were meth addicts. They had criminal records. They had recent arrests. They had been getting money from Amy Berg.
Wow.
I mean, Amy Berg was giving money to Amanda. Amy Berg was feeding Amanda drugs.
Wow. How do you know this?
Those are things that Amanda has claimed since the three were released.
Wow.
Now, officially, she hasn't ever said it under oath. That's been things she said in Facebook posts. Amy Berg was really trying to turn Amanda against Terry Hobbs.
Who is Amy Berg, for those who don't know?
She was the director of West of Memphis, and she was working with Eccles Baldwin on West of Memphis and telling their story about Terry Hobbs. And that's all it is a story about Terry Hobbs.
And Eccles was an executive producer.
Correct.
On that.
Correct. So it wasn't an objective. It wasn't any more objective than Paradise Lost ever was. It was entirely an advocacy piece.
Wow.
And you know what's ironic is that while they complain about negative stories about Eccles having been used against him at his trial and having been used to, quote, railroad him onto death row, that's exactly what they were trying to do to Terry Hobbs.
Wow.
They were bringing in these negative stories and they were telling him every chance they got and repeating him every chance they got in order to make the world look at Terry Hobbs and think, oh, he's the murderer, even though that's allegedly not the right way to do things when it's Damien Eccles.
But when they do it, it's fine.
Yeah,
but,
oh yeah.
And who is Amanda, for those who don't know?
Amanda is Terry and Pam Hicks, Terry's former wife. That's their daughter. She was 5 when Steve was killed.
Wow. And this is what we know went on behind the scenes. I'll once again recommend the documentary A Murder in the Park, which will show you what went on in one of these innocence fraud campaigns behind the scenes. Just visually, you can see it.
Correct.
There's also great books. Martin Pribe has written about it. But to visually see it is a different thing, and that's why I always recommend it.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happened at this press conference, the West Memphis Threes, in August of 2011? What was their attitude when they were released?
Basically, their story at the press conference was that they were basically forced to do this because that's what the state wanted them to do.
Mm-hmm.
In reality, after this July 25th, 2011 report, Eccles' attorneys reached out to the prosecutors and said, hey, what if our clients enter an Alford plea? And Scott Ellington, the lazy MF that he is, said, sure, perfect. That maintains the convictions, ensures the state isn't going to be liable for anything to anybody, and closes the case and ends all post-conviction claims. Mm-hmm. Eccles, as well as Baldwin and Miss Kelly. So it was a win-win for Ellington.
That press conference is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Though, can you talk about just what they said? They were going to work from the outside. tirelessly.
Correct.
It wouldn't rest until they exonerated themselves. And there were even Facebook groups opened called Exonerate the West Memphis Three. Now that we've freed them, let's exonerate them. And what did Eccles and Baldwin and Miss Kelly do to exonerate themselves?
They've done absolutely nothing. Except I think they align themselves with Bob Ruff in 2017. Mm-hmm. And if you notice, every time their case starts to fade, somebody else comes up like Bob Ruff, mm-hmm. who is an idiot. Because he thinks he has no standing, but he thinks he can talk to Scott Ellington, and Scott Ellington's going to send DNA evidence or send crime evidence on his word to a lab for MVAC testing. Mm-hmm. And he thinks that Ellington not doing that is wrong. When, first of all, Ellington's not the custodian of that evidence, so he has no right to direct its disposition anywhere. And second of all, Bob Ruff has no standing.
It perfectly, to me, exemplifies these wrongful conviction activists. They just want it their way. They have no respect for the rule of law or
correct
procedure or how things are done.
They remain willfully ignorant of the legal procedures required to accomplish their goals. And then they lie and misrepresent it to the public as though they have an entitlement to those goals. And that's what they're doing now. Because for any DNA testing to have ever been done, Eccles, Baldwin, and Miss Kelly would have had to have requested it and had a court order the West Memphis PD or the Arkansas State Crime Lab or even Bode, if Bode has evidence, to send this evidence somewhere else for new testing.
Because they had millions were poured. I mean, it's been estimated that 10 to 20 million was put into the West Memphis Three. It could be more. That figure has never been refuted. So they had the best experts, the best lawyers, best appellate lawyers, best PR, best everything on this. They test the DNA. It's not helpful to them. We have never seen those DNA results, and instead they asked to plead guilty by an Alford plea, and then instead they release to the public that we have this hair of another stepfather. We know who's done it. Arkansas begged us to take this Alford plea because they didn't want to pay out wrongful conviction money.
Right.
Which they didn't pay out at the time, right? Which is my understanding.
Another excuse made was when they won their retrial, it would take years to retry him. And Eccles was dying in prison.
Oh, right. He was dying of bad teeth and bad eyesight, which miraculously was cured when he got released.
And as I pointed out to many, many supporters during that time, you're putting the cart before the horse. They had the burden of proof at those hearings. And I think that's another thing that they remain willfully ignorant to. At those hearings, the state was not going to have to prove them guilty. At those hearings, the burden was on them to prove that they were actually innocent. And if the state was able to marshal witnesses from Miss Kelly's prison who could attest or testify to the fact that he made multiple admissions of guilt over the course of the last 5 years prior to the hearings, their case was going to go down the drain. I personally have always believed that something did not exclude one or all of them in that additional testing that they've never disclosed the results of. And that is why they came up with the Alford plea, because they hadn't disclosed it to the prosecutor. And if they did, that was going to be, his entire case.
Because if you know the history of other cases like this, if they have anything, any piece of DNA at all,
correct,
they will parade it around, and they would have to release the whole report. And common sense will tell you that the report was not helpful to them. In fact, probably pretty damning. And that's why the last thing they had to pleading guilty after $20 million spent,
correct,
$10 to $20 million spent is not a great result for them.
And their attorneys actually approached Dustin McDaniel. And I think that there's a conflict of interest because Patrick Benka is in practice with Dustin McDaniel.
Who is this Patrick Benka character?
He's a local attorney. He came on as local counsel, probably because the Innocence Project or whatever was paying him handsomely to be local counsel. He had ties to McDaniel. So he was able to kind of be a liaison with McDaniel, who at the time was the Attorney General. Again, and I think that the state did not know that they had something heavily damaging to their claims of actual innocence. Ellington made the hugest mistake of all, and it proves people saying he wasn't a litigator. It proves he wasn't a litigator. They come to Brent Davis with this, proposal of an Alford plea. Brent Davis says, well, let's revisit that after the hearings. If they get new trials, we'll consider an Alford plea.
That's fair. Because who wants to try a case 20 years later?
Right, exactly. But when they're, in a way, coming to the state for an Alford plea at that point was showing their cards and showing that they did not have confidence in actually winning new trials. Laser's saying I was going to give you new trials because Laser's saying that based on what they've presented, the state had never presented anything to refute that.
Back to this lawsuit from Patrick Benka looking for this evidence. Why isn't Baldwin or Miss Kelly involved in this, or even Eccles? Why isn't his name on this?
Because none of them made the FOIA request to the West Memphis Police Department. So under the law of FOIA, they can't.
Oh, okay.
But if money's awarded, it's going to go to Patrick Benka. It's not going to go to Eccles. And it's not going to go to Miss Kelly or Baldwin because Benka wasn't asking anything on their behalf.
Interesting.
The other false claims made in the current PR campaign that the documents that they signed at the time of the Alfred plea somehow bound the state to allow additional testing, send evidence where they wanted evidence to go for testing. That's totally false. While they claimed in their press conference that they were going to work from the outside, that's not addressed in their actual Alfred plea documents.
And they even had to sign away all liability, too.
Correct. They had to sign away their right to pursue any future claims, which I would argue would be additional DNA testing.
I would think that would be right. I mean, and I'll try to link those documents in the description of this episode so people can look at them.
Yeah, I'm going to try and get them scanned in and I'll get them to you.
We've been talking about DNA, but do you consider the West Memphis Three a DNA case?
No, not at all, because the bodies were found submerged in water, had been submerged in water for probably upwards of 18 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to obliterate just about any DNA, even epithelial DNA.
Mm-hmm.
And after this length of time, what you're going to find good profiles on is more likely than not contamination unrelated to the case, because the case occurred at a time when handling was not as controlled as it is now.
What do you think the most clear and convincing evidence against the West Memphis Three is?
Jesse Miss Kelly's confessions, Baldwin's admissions, Eccles' admissions, the fact that the victims were last seen going into the woods and they never came out, the fact that neither Eccles, Baldwin, nor Miss Kelly can account for their whereabouts at that time,
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that the three victims matches up with three perpetrators. It's unlikely that one person could have controlled all three boys.
Mm-hmm. And then you have also the knots being tied different ways.
Correct. You've got the different knots. You've got the fiber evidence that was found on the clothing that was probably the result of secondary transfer from clothing in Eccles' environment and in Baldwin's environment.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's not conclusive, but if two hairs are somehow conclusive as to Terry Hobbs's guilt,
Right.
then those fibers should be considered conclusive as to Eccles and Baldwin's guilt.
I find West Memphis Three supporters are the hardest to talk to. For example, I find Jesse Miss Kelly's, all of his confessions, extremely damning.
Yes.
But supporters will only listen or read the first one and say, well, look, it's not 100% correct. Well, if it has to be 100% correct, then free Chris Watts.
Right.
Because his first confession wasn't 100. Let's get him out of prison. If that's the new standard for confessions, but
right.
They don't look at all of them. Then they'll say he was coerced every single time, which isn't even a concept.
Mm-hmm.
It's coerced confession, not coerced multiple confessions up to 7 or 8 times.
Correct.
Against your best interest in all different post-conviction, to a supporter, they're all over the place,
Mm-hmm.
to the police on your way to jail or prison.
More likely than not while he was incarcerated.
Right. We got the prison letter from his...
That's another suspicion that I have, is that they knew that there were going to be prison guards coming to testify about Miss Kelly's admissions.
Interesting. And the way that they treat him, too, the West Memphis Three treats Miss Kelly, to me, as someone who's lived life on planet Earth, seems so obvious that he's the one spilling the beans. They all three of them has confessed, but the way they treat Miss Kelly is the way a snitch is treated.
Well, I think that he's always been ignored to a degree. They do pay lip service and say, oh, we don't blame him. You know, he was so dumb. He just couldn't, withstand the pressure from the police. But he was ignored in the fundraising. I mean, his dad really was his best advocate when his dad was alive, because his dad is the one that reached out to the people in California and said, this isn't right. And his dad was so ignorant that getting free merchandise from the folks in California, he thought he was getting something really good.
What do you mean free merchandise?
He got bumper stickers and T-shirts and things like that. And the people in the trailer park, had bumper stickers on their cars and wore T-shirts. So he was street smart, but he wasn't street smart enough to really make a living out of it the way Eccles. But, Eccles hasn't treated his family well.
No. Has he seen his son since he's been out?
No. He has not. And he didn't have anything to do with his sister or his mother. But they, of course, toe the party line as well.
And I've challenged the West Memphis Three supporters to find me one picture of Eccles since his release with his son, and
Hmm.
they failed to bring it up. But they'll still tell me I'm a terrible person.
Yeah.
But it happens to be true. And when Janice Peorage, the occultist musician, died, Eccles is announcing, "This is my mother figure. This man is my mother figure, just died."
Hmm.
And I don't remember any announcement when his own mother died. Did he announce it?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, I don't keep. Yeah, I'm blocked. Yeah, I'm blocked from
Yeah.
all of them, but Miss Kelly have blocked me in one way or the other. And I've had no interaction with them. It's so interesting. So there you go. Actually, that's not true. Baldwin, I did retweet something. I think that's when I got the block from him. But Eccles, I believe, did a preemptive block on me. So why do you think people are so attached to this story of innocence?
I don't know. I guess because it sells well, especially for the media.
Hmm.
So that's why they'll perpetuate it and they'll close their eyes to whatever doesn't fit. And they don't ask the questions. I mean, I was watching an interview with Patrick Banka about the DNA testing requests that they were making to Ellington and later Keith Cressman. And the reporter didn't say, well, why haven't you filed a petition requesting testing? Because then the court would order the West Memphis PD to catalog all the evidence and tell you what's where and who has it, because the court's got to be the one to order testing. And there's actually in one of the exchanges with Keith Crestman very recently, back in April of 2021, Crestman told Banka, releasing the material isn't my decision. The property is seized. It doesn't belong to my office. So you'll need to petition the court asking for permission and giving the state an opportunity to be heard, probably on that 3-year issue. But in anticipation of your client's motion, I've asked the West Memphis Police Department to catalog what remaining evidence there is. And I mean, that's April of 2021. Banka is told by Cressman, you need to file a motion. So why was there no motion filed? Why would they follow it up in July with a letter asking about the status of the evidence and catalogs, asking all these questions about the evidence when what they want is DNA testing?
So what I'm hearing is that this is another West Memphis 3 PR move. And the aim is to do what? To get what across to the public? That this is something nefarious went on? That Eccles and Baldwin still want to exonerate themselves? Is that the point?
Well, I think that is they've got to give the appearance of innocence.
Okay.
So they've got to continue to give the appearance of innocence, in spite of the fact that they're convicted felons, 3 counts of first-degree murder. They want the public to believe that they're not really guilty, that, they were forced into this, because it gives them the opportunity to rehash this crap over and over. Like, we didn't want the Alford plea. We had exculpatory evidence, but we were forced by the state to take this Alford plea. I had to save Eccles' life. I had to do this. I didn't want it. And now look at this. Now they've destroyed the evidence. Well, you pled guilty. The case was closed.
Right. That's a very important point.
Although there is a requirement that evidence be maintained. And another issue, another burden of proof that they're going to have to meet is, if evidence was destroyed, they are going to have to prove that it was in bad faith.
Mm-hmm.
If the evidence was moved to a storage container because repairs had to be made to a building after 20 years or 15 years, and then a fire occurred in the storage container that was accidental, then the destruction of the evidence was not done in bad faith.
Mm-hmm.
And these are all things, these are all questions that only the state can answer.
Mm-hmm.
But we see all these people saying it was done in bad faith, it was deliberate, it's to keep these poor innocent people down, when, that's their speculation.
Mm-hmm.
My falling out with Michael was due to his speculation.
This is your co-host on the Clear and Convincing podcast, right?
My former co-host from Clear and Convincing, which is no more. But this is a chance for them to rehash the old crap. It's a chance for them to continue to circulate the misinformation. They have the assistance of the media to circulate the misinformation and to even get some more misinformation out there.
Is there anything we missed on this West Memphis Three story before I move on to Rodney Reed?
No, I think basically, the bottom line is if they had really wanted DNA testing, first of all, they should have asked for it in 2014. Second of all, they should not have waited until 2020 and let Bob Ruff do it for them because he had no standing to do so. Even with their blessing, he had no standing. And he was an idiot to think that he could get it. And he's an idiot to tell the public that he was somehow entitled to it. And basically, he's just an idiot. And I hope he hears this. And I'd love to talk to his ass again because I've got some tough questions for him. And then also that if they really wanted DNA testing, they would have asked a court in 2021. They would not have spent months going back and forth with the prosecutors wanting evidence sent to a lab when under the law, that's not how it works. And they know this.
And also, I'd like the audience to understand when you plead guilty by an Alford, it's legally, we've gone over this, a guilty plea, but that means that the West Memphis Three in 2014, when they could have tested, 2011, when they could have asked for the 2014, could have asked for the testing of the DNA evidence, they were walking around as twice, legal rarity, twice convicted triple child killers.
Right.
And they're comfortable walking around as a paroled, convicted triple child killer.
Correct. And, another thing that we have to point out, I think it's very important to point out, and it's a fact that is missed. They are the only case where a hearing on a motion for due trial is set and they ask for the Alford plea before that goes forward. Michael Peterson, he took an Alford plea after. Michael Peterson got a new trial and then he took an Alford plea.
Right.
I think Sonny Jacobs got a new trial and then took an Alford plea or a reduced plea. You don't take a plea before your new trial hearing. So they were in an inferior position when they went to the prosecutors with the Alford plea deal because they had yet to prove they were actually innocent.
That's a really good point. I don't know anyone else who knows more about the Rodney Reed case than you. You are the premier expert on that case. Speaking of failed PR innocence fraud campaigns, what's going on with the Rodney Reed case? Where is it now? And how do you feel about the PR campaign? They put up with heavy hitters, Oprah, Dr. Phil, but
yeah,
I don't know if it's done so well. What do you think?
Well, currently we're waiting for Judge Langley to make his findings of fact and conclusions of law and recommendation to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. I believe that he expects to do that by the end of this month.
And what do you think his chances are on that?
I think it is going to be very unlikely that Langley is going to order a new trial. While the statements allegedly made by Fennell are compelling on the surface, the fact that the witnesses did not come forward during the original murder investigation, and they're almost all dealing with statements made prior to Stacy's murder or shortly after Stacy's murder in 1996. The fact that these witnesses, most of whom were law enforcement, by the way, didn't come forward, it kind of weakens their credibility.
I would say so. I think we've talked about this before. I thought one of the most interesting things about the 2020 episode that you were in, Stacey Stites, The Girl in the Pines, is you see the Innocence Project investigator driving around in this fancy car trying to find witnesses decades later. It's just the money.
Yeah.
The money.
Yeah.
The money that's been put into this campaign is amazing.
Right. But even witnesses to the alleged affair, which, again, these are people that are talking about things that happened prior to Stacy's murder. So why, when she was murdered, did they not come forward and say, have you talked to Rodney Reed? She was messing around with him.
And what is the woman's name who worked, but she worked different shifts with Stacy at the...
Alicia Slater.
I find that...
Yeah, she finally got her chance to testify. I wasn't able to go, and it wasn't televised, but I will be ordering the transcripts from the Court of Criminal Appeals once the records are completely lodged.
But you did a great episode with Stacey Stites' sister, Deborah Oliver, and what an amazing advocate she is for her sister.
Yes.
And she reported on what had happened was that the same hearing we're talking about?
Yes, she was present for some of it. She wasn't able to attend every day. But again, and one of the things that the Innocence Project cannot overcome is the DNA evidence. They portray it as a little bit of DNA found in Stacey's vagina, but in reality, it was saliva DNA on her breast, DNA in her vagina, DNA in her panties, and now, after 2014 additional DNA testing outside of Chapter 64, DNA on her pants and back brace.
What does Chapter 64 mean?
That is the Texas DNA testing statute.
Okay, thank you.
You know, another thing, another misconception that the public has is that all prisoners have a right, an inalienable right to DNA testing to prove their innocence. And that is not true. The DNA testing statutes, to get DNA testing, you have to first of all prove that the evidence exists. You have to prove it's in a condition sufficient for DNA testing. And you have to prove that had those exculpatory results been available at the time of your trial, that you would not have been convicted. And with Rodney Reed, he cannot prove that had an exculpatory result been found with the belt, no DNA from him or DNA from Jimmy Fennell, that he would not have been convicted. And that's simply not the case, because no DNA on the belt does not trump saliva DNA, DNA from her panties, DNA from her pants and her back brace, that all point to Rodney Reed.
The Innocence Project's reputation, what they say they're about is, we represent people who were tried without DNA. Now with this great DNA technology, we test the DNA, and if it comes back as someone else, we free them. That's their rep. We both know it's much more complicated and nuanced than that, what they really do. But why are they representing Rodney Reed? This is a guy where the DNA is so overwhelmingly against him.
Because they have crafted what they believe is a convincing argument that explains away the DNA. And I hope that the next time they represent a rapist, that 20 years later, DNA isn't found from that rapist, that a prosecutor turns this argument around on them and uses it against them, and a judge agrees.
But you know that if any of these people that they pulled out of the woodwork years later said damning things about Rodney Reed, they would have Elizabeth Loftus up there saying contamination.
Exactly. Oh, exactly.
They don't know what they read it in the paper.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever evidence is against them, eyewitness testimony not reliable, whatever it is,
Right.
DNA contaminated, whatever is against them, it's no good. But whatever's for them is the holy grail.
Correct. And like I said, I think that they have, in this particular case, first of all, I think that their main objective is they're trying to undermine and abolish the death penalty across the board in every state in the United States.
And they're also passing a lot of laws for wrongful conviction money. I mean, they're
Correct.
taking apart our justice system.
Correct.
Pretty nicely right now.
So I think that is because Rodney Reed was sentenced to death. If he was sentenced to life in prison, and they might not have taken on his case.
Just out of my own personal curiosity, for people like us, there's just a few of us out there screaming about the wrongful conviction movement as a movement, being an innocence fraud movement, basically. Do you think it would be better if they could abolish the death penalty and that was off the table?
No, once they abolish the death penalty, then they're going to go against life without parole.
That's what I believe too.
And then they're going to go against life. And, then they're going to want people sentenced to go into bed without dessert. You killed 5 people.
Right.
No dessert for you.
Right.
They're going to chip away, because the other thing is the quote mass incarceration. Well, people incarcerated are incarcerated because they committed crimes, but somehow that is lost. And it becomes these people all being unfairly incarcerated for no reason, the prison industry to make money.
Industrial complex, right?
Yeah, it's basically they're going to go after prison.
But they don't want to make the prisons better.
No.
They don't put no money into that. It's the oddest movement. Lisa O'Brien, where can people find you?
Currently, I am looking for a new platform, a new home, a new way of broadcasting a podcast. And that is in the works. I don't know. Hopefully, by the end of the year, I'll have something put together.
Okay.
And I may have to enlist the talents of your wonderful editor.
Oh,
Is she
the goddess
the
Addie.
goddess Audie? Yes, the goddess Audie. And probably I may go with a Zoom because I did like the online Facebook Live platform.
I can't wait. As a fan, I can't wait to see what you do next. Thanks so much for this interview.
This is another concept I've been kind of toying with, and I've talked to people at my office about it. I'm going to talk to you about it. I'm going to talk on the air about it. What I was thinking of doing until I find a permanent co-host is I was thinking about having guest co-hosts.
That would be awesome.
You suggest a case, I'll do the research, I'll put together the case notes, I'll send them to you, and then you and I will talk about the case on a podcast.
Love to. What's the case I wanted to talk to you about? I'm trying to think of one. I was like, oh, I have to talk to Lisa about that. It was Glossop.
Richard Glossop, yeah.
Yeah, I had a lot of questions about Richard Glossop. I know you've already done that, but
I have a potential co-host who has been following the lethal injection challenge in Oklahoma.
oh, that'll be interesting.
So I probably will get together with her and try to make that one of my first episodes because I was going to talk to her on Clear and Convincing, and then that went crazy. So if she's listening to Roberta Glass, please message me on Facebook, send me a friend request. Melody, I will, because I no longer have access to the messaging from Clear and Convincing.
Okay.
So yeah, I didn't really think that process through.
Well, it'll work. Lisa, it's all right. It'll work out.
Yeah, we'll figure it out.
Lisa, thank you so much.
Thank you, Roberta, and it was great being back on the air.
Oh, my pleasure.